Hollywood. It's Halloween.
Good evening. I'm Eddie Spuhghetti, host, video editor, and Hollywood so-and-so, and happy Halloween. That day is here, finally. I was basically thinking, like, last week or so, what it was that I wanted to talk about today with you. And I felt that it would be most appropriate to talk about some past Halloween experiences of mine. Specifically because whenever I tell people about them, they're kind of like, oh, that's really interesting. And it's like nothing that's terrible. I appreciate the fact that I got to experience Halloween in a bunch of specific ways, and it never was like that I was sheltered from it or anything like that. I was allowed to go as whatever the hell I wanted. I could eat any of the candy that I wanted. There wasn't any like rules, so to speak, about that sort of stuff. There wasn't any religious shit going on, but there was little odds and ends in between there that are just kind of like more so reflections of, things in the past when people were like really into specific types of media, and it'll make sense when I get into it. So if you watched a couple of my other videos, you probably noticed through the intro that there's like a specific clip of a skull. That's actually footage from my Halloween in 1994, where I was playing with my dad's lab skull. And I remembered it had a name. I don't exactly remember what the name was. I want to say it was Julius, but I could be wrong. But we used to play with it like it was like a toy almost. Like it was just kind of like not so much a toy. I didn't play with it like it was a toy. It was freaky, but it was also really interesting. And the fact that my dad had given it a nickname kind of added this element of like, oh, it's harmless. Like it's not scary, like I never thought, oh, this is the shit that's inside my head right now. Like I have one of those, that never hit me, it still hasn't until now. But, Halloween for me was a really interesting time because it was a mixture of a lot of the stuff that I really loved. And I'm not the type of person that's like, gloating about the fact that I've always been into horror stuff. I've been into a weird specific amount of horror stuff, like a specific area of it. So I've never been like a huge fan of Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, even when I was a kid. That shit scared the fuck out of me. I was more so into Universal monsters, specifically Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, the werewolf, the Wolfman, the werewolf, the Mummy, Phantom of the Opera, Bride of Frankenstein, Dwight Frye in all of his roles. The list goes on. And that was more so the type of stuff that I was into back then. So for me to be able to see a lot of that stuff, and also, the reason why I was able to see a lot of it at that point in time when Halloween was around was because in the early to mid 90s, going into the late 90s even, a lot of the Halloween merch and decorations and that sort of stuff were the high end of that sort of stuff. The licensing was Universal Monsters related, but also the low end of the licensing, which is like the dollar store stuff, also tapped into like the designs of the Frankenstein monster from Universal, with little minor adjustments made so nobody gets sued. You could find that stuff anywhere. Like Lugosi's image of the vampire basically became the status quo for what a vampire looked like or what Dracula looked like just in general, and it's still the same to this day, which I think says a lot about his portrayal and just the imagery that was sparked from that film. So I mean, like, being a kid who's really into that sort of stuff, and then maybe like a whole month or so, because again, this was back in the day when like you did not see Halloween shit pop up until legit October. Basically like a whole month or so, I was able to see a lot of the stuff that I loved, and it was like being appreciated by a lot more people than just myself and my parents, which were the only people that I really knew that actually liked that sort of stuff. And especially when you're a kid, when you meet people who share common interests as you, or you're able to see something that, you're really invested in or appreciate or adore that is being appreciated on a higher level than just yourself, it's kind of like this weird sense of like gratification and like acceptance to a degree. It's like other people acknowledge the fact that what you're into is also considered cool. This is the early to mid 90s or so when I grew up. I was born in the late 80s, and going through that period of time, you know, there was like a transition from what was being done in the 80s, which was, you know, a little bit more going into the merchandise stuff for Halloween decor. We saw a lot more like trademarked content. People are still using a lot of sound effect tapes. So those were very common still. Nobody's using fucking projectors or anything like that. That was not a thing until recently. And it was very humble. And you had also people who were like devoted to it to a degree that like you had people who were basically acting as props. I remember going to a house once and there was a guy who just like laid on the ground as a murder victim. Like he didn't get up or anything like that. He was just laying on the ground as a murder victim. And I don't know how long he laid there for the night. I'm assuming he got up and got himself a beer or something like that. But, you know, that's the dedication to back then. You know, it wasn't so easy just to like find a dummy somewhere or something like that. Like you needed the murder victim. One of you had to portray that murder victim. Now, when it came to costumes for myself, I had a really interesting repertoire of choices, some of which I never actually got to dress up as. One of which was the Rocketeer. I really wanted to dress up as the Rocketeer one year. I got close to it, but something happened and it didn't go forward. And I don't really remember why. I think it was probably because I didn't really have an opportunity to find some of the parts for the costume. But yeah, Rocketeer never happened. Really missed out on that one. But, you know, I had other choices. Superman, The Mask. I think I was a vampire one year. So it was, you know, fairly basic, but in tune to my interests specifically at the same time. And yeah, I never had anything necessarily that was store-bought either. A lot of the costumes that I had were homemade. I remember specifically going to, you know, Salvation Armies to find fabric or just like pieces of clothing that were going to eventually be turned into the costume by my mom. We never had anything that was store-bought. Like even buying a mask was like something that was almost like taboo. And I think it was probably because they were a little bit expensive. And, you know, they are nowadays too. Like when you go into a lot of these costume shops or like the fucking going into Spirit Halloween or whatever like that, and you look at the prices of some of these things and it's like outrageous amounts for just a little bit of like latex or something like that. So I mean, I'm assuming back then it was probably something similar, like it was a little bit of an investment to buy a shitty Halloween mask or something like that. But one of the things about the costumes that I had that just drove me up the fucking wall was name tags. Because you needed to have name tags. And what I mean specifically my name tags is, imagine someone walking around dressed up as James Bond and wearing a lanyard around their neck saying, "Hi, I'm James Bond, secret agent." You see a kid dressed up in a little tuxedo thing or whatever like that, and you're just kind of like, oh, he's supposed to be somebody, I guess. I don't know. But I mean, I didn't even have a gun. I think I had a briefcase or something like that and like a scarf. So if anything, I just kind of looked like Mr. Howell or something like that. I looked like some kid in a little suit. But I mean, dressing up as James Bond, like there's so many different memorable outfits that James Bond could wear. And I mean, nowadays, like we've seen him in like the Hawaiian shirt in Casino Royale or whatever he was wearing. So, you know, that's not really a specific costume, but the fact is that it was for any costume. I think the only costume I didn't have to do that on was Superman. I believe it was the only one I didn't have to do that because it was just fucking obvious who the hell I was. But I think the reason why that we had the label stuff going on is because at this point in time, I think my dad got access to a dot matrix printer or a laser jet printer or something like that. And he was really into using Corel Draw specifically to design a lot of the labels for our VHS tapes. And I don't even know really what else we had labels for, but really specifically VHS tapes and Halloween costumes. And I think it was just like the usage of all the little like avatars and like icons and emojis and stuff at the time that were like cool. And I mean, I understand it to a degree too. Like, you go from having a label maker to all of a sudden you can like kind of do whatever the hell you want in black and white. But and eventually they did get access to a color printer. So, I mean, that kind of added a little bit of extra something. But I mean, as a kid, it was like, I really want to wear this costume and I don't really want to walk around with this fucking name tag hanging around my neck telling everybody who I am when it's painfully obvious who I am. So I don't know if any of you out there actually got to encounter this as well. You had to wear a name tag. If you did, you will totally understand where I'm getting at, as this sounds very minuscule, but as a kid and you're really devoted and interested in wearing this costume and you almost want to like play the part to a degree, and then you have this fucking name tag hanging around your neck. So that was a fun one. The next one I want to talk about was the candy carrying system that we had. Oh boy. Okay, so we couldn't use pillowcases. For some fucking reason, we couldn't use pillowcases. What we had to use were apple picking bags, and they could only carry so much candy. So basically what happened is that we would go to a specific orchard every year, and they would have a really specific type of bag, and it's basically like a thicker plastic bag, but it's short. It's not very tall, so you can only fill it to somewhat of a degree worth of apples. And these bags, I kind of understand the reasoning with the fact that they were strong, but at the same time, they just didn't carry enough. It was this thing where every year it was like, all right, here, take your little bag. And it was just like the same bag with this farmer on the side or something like that. And you were walking around with this thing. And then you were using that to carry all the candy that you had. And the downside was that you can only make it through like maybe like one street, like maybe one side. I can't really remember, depend on how long the street was, but we had to make like at least 2 or 3 trips back to our house just to unload. Yeah, I don't think I remember ever seeing anybody else carrying around these apple bags with them. I remember people just carrying around, either it was like a themed Halloween bag or it was like a pillowcase, which is the best fucking bag. Okay, if you're a kid and you're watching this and listening to me swear like a fucking sailor and stuff, I'm going to tell you right now, use a pillowcase. Just use a pillowcase. Let's talk a bit about the content that was in that apple bag. And I'm talking about the candy. The candy back then in the early to mid 90s was substantially different compared to at least what I've noticed more so nowadays in the grocery stores. And you have to remember as well that I grew up in Canada, so the type of candy that we had access to was drastically, I think, as far as I know, was drastically different compared to what was in the States. But the staples of like mainly the chocolate bar stuff seems to be the same. As far as I can tell, like there isn't really many variants of chocolate bar that isn't available anymore. I know it's hard to say too. It's like the sizes of the candy might have changed, but I mean, at the same time, I was so tiny back then that the fun size stuff might have even looked bigger to me than it actually was. But specifically, there's definitely a couple things that are not around anymore, or at least that I've noticed. One of them is taffy sticks. The ones on a stick, basically. It was like, I don't even remember the names of them, but it would come in like a wax wrapper that was like yellow. I think one of them was like supposed to be like a baseball bat or something like that, but those things I have not seen for quite a long time. Another one is bags of peanuts. I really specifically remember getting bags of peanuts, and I don't even remember eating them. I think my parents just took them and used them for something, or they might have eaten them. I have no idea. But to get bags with just shelled peanuts inside, thinking about that now, it's like, wow. Just putting peanuts, straight up, a bag of Ziploc peanuts in there. Holy shit. And chiclets. Chiclets is another one that I've not seen for quite a long time. And that was one that you got a crap ton of because they were so cheap. It's a little box. There's 2 pieces of gum in them. You chew them up for like not even a minute and you're done. Terrible gum. For whatever reason, it's like a comforting gum to me. If that's a thing. I mean, like Big League Chew is probably like my favorite gum because it's Big League Chew. But chiclets is very nostalgic for me because of the fact that you got so many of those little boxes, and I used to kind of see them as like this interim candy, or this kind of like, it was like an in-between candy. It was like when you were eating the good stuff and you wanted to eat something else, but you didn't want to take out of the like lesser good stuff, you just kind of put in this like, pastime of just eating chiclets in between, just to kind of keep your sugar high going as a kid. I don't really know what is the equivalent nowadays. I want to say it's probably Bazooka Joe. I would imagine like something like that is probably the closest thing to an equivalent. Maybe those little candies that's like a little strawberry. And I mean, also like a lot of things have changed quite a bit considering how we perceive the nutrition that kids are getting these days. And, especially Allergies is a really big fucking factor too. I think Allergies has totally changed the scope for the better, because honestly, like, I don't want to fucking have my kid get sick or like potentially die because some asshole put in a bag of peanuts, which is not going to be a thing you're going to see anymore. But you know what I mean? Like, it's being smart about it. And I agree that we should have the ability to choose what we want to be giving out, but also being respectful of the fact that there are kids out there who have allergies, and so there are still a lot of other choices besides candy with peanuts in it. As much as I love candy with peanuts, I adore peanuts. In fact, I think anything that I had that had peanuts in it, I would probably save in my bag of candy back when I was a kid. I would probably hold on to that as long as I could. Wonder Bar especially. After maybe about like 3 or 4 apple bags worth of candy, maybe 5, you come home, you don't really notice that there's a decent amount of it that's already been eaten. There might be 1 or 2 things that you for sure saw somebody put in your bag that isn't there anymore. But one of the cool things is sorting through all the candy that you have and doing it as you sit on the floor and you got the TV going. And what's on the TV. And obviously nowadays there's a lot more choice with all the streaming networks and channels and etc. that we have access to. We can pick and choose easily what kind of content we want to watch. But in the 90s, that was not possible unless you owned a physical copy of like a Halloween special or a movie that you wanted to watch, obviously. And I specifically really remember watching the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror specials. That was one of the best things that aired on Halloween whenever I was, sorting through my candy or something like that. I think the Halloween specials from the Simpsons, the Treehouse of Horror specials, were phenomenal. And I still highly regard them as some of the greatest Halloween specials in history. They have a really specific style to them that was a little more mature. There's a lot of wonderful, smart references in them to a lot of classical horror movies. There's a lot of poking fun at some of them. I'll have to do a video about them individually at some point because there's just so much to talk about with the Treehouse of Horror. But specifically for me, despite the fact that I was really into a lot of Universal Monsters stuff, I never really thought to throw that on. I never really thought to request to watch that around that time. It was more like, if the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror is on, just put that on. And luckily around, the mid 90s or so, you had at least a couple of episodes worth of that they started to package them together. So you had a programming block that was basically 3 or 4 of these Treehouse of Horror episodes back to back, usually ending with the newest one. If it was especially on a Sunday, I think Sundays is when the new episodes of The Simpsons came out. So you would have the newest one following up after the older ones. So it was a nice little package of like 2 or 3 hours worth of content and these great Halloween episodes from The Simpsons. And one of the other things that I really appreciated about experiencing Halloween in that time period, specifically in the 90s as a kid, was the creativeness of what people did for their house, what they did for their front doorstep in terms of the decorations that they had. Sometimes they would go as far as like what I mentioned with the guy who was dead on the ground. But music was always a really interesting factor when it came to that sort of stuff. And you had the low spectrum of it, which was really like the sound effects tape or a very obvious like compilation of third-party recorded covers of famous, horror themes or songs. Every single one had Ghostbusters on it, and you could easily tell that it was a cover of Ghostbusters because nobody could match how good Ray Parker Jr. is. But yeah, there was a lot of houses that ran sound effects tapes. You could get sound effects tapes, I think, for almost for nothing back then. I feel as if they gave them away for free in cereal boxes or something. I do know for a fact that there was one that you could get at McDonald's at one point. I remember it was okay. It was nothing special. I think honestly the other sound effect tapes were way better because they actually went to the extent of having people wail and moan on them, and I don't think McDonald's would have gone that far. So you had people using the sound effects tapes, then you had people using the terrible compilations of covers, and then you had a different area of a group of individuals who decided to take it upon themselves to kind of go to the limit and use actual legit scary music. And my dad was one of them. I think he used to pipe the soundtrack from The Fog from his garage. Nobody else that I knew did something like that. Now, if you haven't heard that soundtrack before, first off, The Fog is a early 80s ghost horror movie directed by John Carpenter after he had done Halloween. And it's kind of received more praise, more of recent, it's received more praise. But back in the day, especially even in the 90s, it was just kind of considered a run-of-the-mill horror movie, and just a kind of average one. But for my family, specifically for my parents, The Fog was a very good horror movie and a very scary one. But that was something that was always brought up with fond memories by my parents. And my dad had a tape of the soundtrack that he had recorded, I think, off of Buddy's vinyl, and he used to pump the shit out of that thing off of speakers through the garage every Halloween. It was just part of your childhood. You heard it. It was spooky, but I never really knew the context of it, and I obviously hadn't seen the movie. But years later, it's one of the things that I try to replicate. I'm waiting for the point in time when I have a garage and I can do that sort of thing, because that's exactly what I would do. When we're talking about music coming from the garage, we're not talking about a fog machine from the garage. We're not talking about a light thing from the garage. He legitimately just had a couple speakers in the garage pumping that tape, and then he opened the garage door a little bit so you could hear music coming out, but it was a little bit muffled to a degree, so it wasn't going to bother people. But thinking back on that, I just way to go, Dad, at using that type of music for atmosphere. It's perfect. And I don't know, it added a little bit of something extra to the experience. So I would hope that other people would kind of take up on that. And I think to a degree there has been a lot more. I mean, nowadays there's a whole other generation who are appreciating a lot of those movies way more than they were initially appreciated. And there's, the projectors and that sort of stuff and the light shows, and so those are opportunities to use more of that kind of licensed music or those forgotten scores, and we're distancing ourselves away more from these terrible covers of Ghostbusters, and going into just using content that we have quick access to off YouTube or something like that. So I'm really curious to see how things change in the future regarding the atmosphere of how we celebrate Halloween, and how we like to decorate our homes, and how we like to provide a really interesting experience for especially children. As weird enough, this is a very kid-focused type of holiday. I think more so now over the past maybe 10 years or so, we're starting to drift a little more into it being more adult. But there still is a large aspect of it that is still children-focused. And that's totally important because we're giving kids an opportunity to act out a bit of a fantasy. Candy, kids love candy. That's never going to change. But it's really just one night of the year to let a kid embrace a bit of a fantasy and to embrace the darker side of things, but to also be reminded that it's okay to be scared of some of that stuff, and it's okay to be curious about the supernatural or the darker side of things. I think it's a human element that we're always super curious about that sort of stuff, and it's you know, it's nice to have a day of the year that we can kind of get our kids a little more used to it or a little more aware of it, so that, you know, when they see those UFOs in the sky, they're not like, what the fuck is that? So that was a little bit of a trip down memory lane to a degree for me, but why don't you tell me a bit about, you know, what you did when you were a kid for Halloween? Like, what was unique to you? What was something that made an impact on you that you still remember it to this day? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear. And until the next time we chat, have a good one and stay safe.